Page number 261 continued. It is an improvement on the jampans and dandies, which used to be the only means of conveyance before the rickshaws came. For the jampan, which was not unlike a four-poster bed with curtains for protection against the sun and the rain, was, though comfortable enough for the rider, rather a back-aching abomination for the coolies. And the dundee, a piece of loose footrest, was, if anything, slightly worse, because it grated the shoulders of the men away. But as in all matters, it was ultimately the preference of the riders of jampans and dandies which led to the change. Lying flat on the back in a jampan and being carried by four men continually evoked the illusion of being carried in a hearse, and if the ascent up the seat of the dundee was not carefully negotiated, a half somersault backwards resulted, and even when the entrance was safely accomplished, the rider always appeared to himself to be occupying a rather undignified position. The Reverend J. Fordyce, chaplain of St. Mark's Church, was much troubled by the uncomfortable thoughts of death and dignity. End of page 261. Now page 262, which arose in the minds of his congregation in the Victorian age, and being very concerned to see that the souls of his flock did not suffer from the discomforts of the body, he concentrated all his efforts to secure an adequate vehicle for the conveyance of their persons from their bungalows to the church and from the church to their bungalows. He invented the rickshaw. The people of Shimla still remember his magnificent model. The hood of that first rickshaw was square and trimmed with fringe, such as dangled from the mantelpiece in many a Berlin tinge. During the early 80s, when Reverend Fordyce J. invented the first rickshaw for Shimla during May, it was not difficult to train the coolies to run the horses, so that soon the jampans and the dandies had been ousted and the rickshaw came in. And of course the genius of Western man for technical achievement improved vastly on the original model in the decades following the death of Reverend J. Fordyce. The first rickshaw was iron-tired and, it is said, used to bump and shake fearfully on the right night of a big dance or other tamasha. Shimla used to be kept up by the continual rumbling roll of hundreds of rickshaws. The rubber tire was introduced in 1898, and in 1904 the municipality made it a condition for securing a license that a rickshaw should have rubber tires in view of the constant wear and tear of the road by the iron wheels. Pneumatic tires came next. Pneumatic, P-N-E-U-M-A-T-I-C. Pneumatic tires came next. With this, the improvement in the cushions and upholstery, it is now a pleasure for the rich to be driven about in rickshaws, especially as they do not disturb slumbering Shimla on their return from all-night revelries. Old Gandhi refused to ride in a rickshaw, as he said it hurt his soul to have to be borne in a carriage driven by human beings. Local opinion concurred that he was the greatest crank in history. The usual length of the Shimla rickshaw is 9 feet, including the shaft, and the breadth is 4 feet. The weight is normally 260 to 360 pounds, exclusive of the weight of the ladies and gentlemen who ride them. The coolies curse the weight of the rickshaw in their hearts, sometimes when they are driving uphill. End of page number 262. Now page 263. And swear under their breath against the balance when occupied by two opulent majesty things, however, which the passengers never noticed as they leaned back while the men heave and push it from the back bar strenuously. Munnu was in difficulties as he pushed the rickshaw on his first day, for though Mrs. Mainwaring had never heard of the rickshaw-men receiving a training for their jobs, because it did not seem to her to require any, Munnu was finding it not altogether an unskilled occupation. Mohan, a young coolie, had told him that the rickshaw driving is an art, as he himself had known from recent experience, could only be learnt from continued employment. He had said that one had to develop strong wind and to learn to handle the rickshaw so as to keep it in balance, that one had to develop a sense of judgment and sure-footedness which is so necessary at turnings and deep gradients. Munnu had waved his advice aside. Now he was beginning to realize that Mohan was right. As he puffed and panted, the coolies encouraged him with shabash, shabash, and they found that the hill was too steep, and when they found that the hill was too steep and was straining him, they pulled and pushed harder and took the responsibility of the rickshaw on themselves. They were kind to him. The rickshaw ascended past the military barracks, where the Viceroy's bodyguard lay encamped for the season, but the circuitous route to the railway board offices and proceeded to the mall. From now onwards, it was less strenuous for the coolies to pull the vehicle, because the ascent up the mall is very gradual, and once the vehicle had reached the new post office, where the upper English bazaar forks away from the lower Indian bazaar, Munnu became quite excited about his job. For always sensitive to the straight, prim beauty of English shops, he found himself pushing the rickshaw by the varied showrooms and windows of Whiteway Laidlaw, Lawrence and Mayo, Sahib Singh and Company, chemists, the modern bookshop, Jones and Jones, silversmiths and jewelers, Muhammad Gul, the furriers, Ho Wong, the Chinese shoemaker, and other fashionable purveyors of goods suited to European tastes. After being borne across the mall once so that everyone should see her, Mrs. Mainwaring directed the coolies to pull up by Devico's restaurant, where she had asked Mrs. Stewart to tea that afternoon. End of page 263. Now page 264. The coolies took the rickshaw away to a stand under the YWCA to wait till they were called again. Munnu was curious to know how the Angrezi log behaved among themselves, and from where he sat he looked into the wonderful restaurant, where sweets were arranged in huge glass cages on one floor, and small tables and cane chairs on the other. Oh, look, Mommy, our coolies are there, cried little Circe impetuously, just as Mrs. Mainwaring was being introduced into polite society. The sight of the rude, dirtily clad, bare-legged creatures, some crouching round a hubble-bubble, some lying flat on the edge of the roadway and on the tin tip of the shed, was a challenge to the complacency of the ladies and gentlemen who had tea at Devico's. But of course the coolies, except for a new arrival like Munnu, did not care, as they rested content in any position in which they found themselves, slight, lissom, strangely still, as if empty and dead. Munnu had fever when he came back after his first day's work as a rickshaw coolie. He had felt his legs breaking with fatigue all the way back. When he got to his room, he felt listless. His limbs sagged. He stretched them, but there seemed no relief. He felt that his throat was parched, so he drank a jug of water. But his hands felt crippled and his legs seemed to sink beneath him. A complete inertia had taken possession of his bones, and the blood in his body was boiling hot. He crouched by the fire in the kitchen and tried to ignore what he felt was only a little fatigue. His head was aching, however, and he felt like reclining on something. He lay down on his back and curled up to receive the full glow of the fire, for he was now shivering. Aladad came back from the bazaar and almost stumbled on Munnu's body in the dark. "Who's that?" he asked, and in answer heard the boy's soft moaning and writhing. WRITHING. He knew he had fever. He ran up to acquaint the Mem Sahib of the catastrophe. Mrs. Mainwaring was very concerned. She was a mother and felt towards this boy now exactly as she had felt towards Ralph when he had been ill. She had him removed upstairs and put him into the bed where the baby slept, in spite of Munnu's protestations that he was only a servant and could not sleep upstairs. End of page 264. Now page 265. And she called a doctor, no less a person than Major Merchant, the health officer of Simla, who stayed near Annandale. Major Merchant came, MARCHANT. Major Merchant came, took Munnu's temperature, prescribed some aspirin, and leaving the boy with the cheering words, "You will soon be well," hastened to satisfy his curiosity about Mrs. Mainwaring. For there seemed to him something strange in this dark-hued lady who had put her servant boy to sleep in her flat. Merchant was a young Indian Christian, and like many converts to Christianity in India, he was originally a cobbler's son whom an English mission had brought up and educated. During the course of his adventurous career in the hands of the Padris, he had always secretly enjoyed the thrill of rubbing shoulders with Englishmen. When he had gone to England and become inured to meeting the English people on a basis of equality, he had begun to regard himself as an Englishman, a belief encouraged by the faultless accent he had acquired, the young chorus girl he had married, and the complete adaptability to European conditions that he had easily cultivated. He had changed his name from Mochi, cobbler, to Merchant. He had forgotten the low-caste boy he was when he first fell into the hands of the mission, and only recognized the successful young IMS officer he had become. The only price he had to pay for this rise from pariahdom to the position of a dignified member of one of the imperial services in India was the regular allowance of half his pay, which he had to send to his wife, who preferred to stay in England. As he had been very poor in his childhood, the loss of 700 rupees a month troubled him. He was stingy and spent little on himself, using his position as the medical officer of Simla to get hospitality freely. But apart from this cancer of regrets about money, which grew in his soul and inclined him sometimes to thoughts of seeking a divorce from the chorus girl, and drove him often to the arms of other people's wives, he was very satisfied with himself. He saw that Mrs. Mainwaring was almost the same color as he, or rather the color he would have liked to be, a dusky hue, such as could be brightened into a pink by constantly rubbing a towel on the cheeks. She must be a Eurasian, he thought, and he knew that it was more easy for an Indian Christian to find an affinity with an Eurasian than either with the natives or with the thoroughbred English. "Who is this boy, Mrs. Manning?" he asked as he came into the drawing room. End of page number 265. Now page 266. "He is a servant I picked up at Bombay," she replied, and continued, "By the way, my name is Mainwaring, Mrs. Mainwaring." "Oh, I'm sorry," the Khansama and Maina said, "Maina or something like that, and I guessed it must be Manning." "No, it is Mainwaring," he said. "Rather a difficult name to pronounce, isn't it?" "Yes, but I am glad you are not a difficult person. Some of the Anglo-Indian community in Shimla are the very limit, you know." "Yes," said Mrs. Mainwaring, but she did not want to criticize the community of which she aspired to be a member. For that matter, Major Marchant had not wanted to institute differences between himself and the English community either, but he was trying to make conversation. "How long have you been here, Mrs. Mainwaring?" "Oh, I only came from home a few days ago." "Really?" said Marchant. "Oh, won't you sit down and have a peg, doctor?" suggested Mrs. Mainwaring, divining the gleam of admiration in the Major's eyes. "Thank you," said Merchant, sitting down eagerly. "Do tell me, how was everything at home?" And they talked of home till it was time for Mrs. Mainwaring to go to dinner with the Stuarts downstairs. They had so much more to say to each other than could be said in a quarter of an hour. So Mrs. Mainwaring asked the Major to tea the next day on the pretext of telling him about her illness, and Major Marchant was of course only too eager to promise to come. Meanwhile, Munnu lay happy to be privileged to sleep in the bungalow, although his temples palpitated with the fever. But the glow of that happiness soon evaporated as the soft tremor of fatigue came creeping up his legs, as the blood ran up and down in his body and turned into a clammy sweat as he tossed about the bed uncomfortably, sighing and remembering his mother. Mrs. Mainwaring came back from dinner and rubbed eau de cologne on his face and pressed his head. She even massaged his body. She was very kind to him. When Munnu had sweated out his fever and recovered, he had to revert back to his position as a servant boy and rickshaw coolie again. He did so quite willingly, page number 267. Since however kind the Mem Sahib had been to him, the deep-rooted feeling of inferiority to the superior people who lived in bungalows and wore Angrezi clothes, which was ingrained in him, had never been lifted. He went on from day to day without a break, attending on Mrs. Mainwaring as she entered the gay round of pleasurable existence in Shimla. Apart from sweeping and dusting the bungalow and running errands for the Mem Sahib and the Khan Sahib, Khansama, he drove the rickshaw as a fourth coolie when his mistress went shopping or took the air each day. For Mrs. Manning had found that India was a veritable paradise for the white woman. She had not spent her time trying to bleach her colour in England in vain. She found that she had plenty of time to waste, for India was the one place in the world where servants were still servants, and one could laze enough through the morning and sleep through the afternoon, happy in the assurance that the cook and the boy would look after the breakfast, lunch, tea and dinner. India was the one place in the world where one could come in to dress and leave the discarded garments in a heap on the floor, to be collected and folded away by the servants, whose mending needle stitched up every rent unbidden, and who picked up the ladders in one's stockings with uncanny skill. One could engage a pony for a morning trot at Anandale for less than a shilling a day. One could hire a rickshaw for 14 pence at an hour. Eggs were here were 6 pence a dozen. The laundry washed beautifully at a farthing apiece. One could get the latest Paris models in millinery and frocks at the big shops. There were magnificent hotels, nightclubs, and cinemas which received the latest Hollywood release even even before London. And one could belong to one of the 3 clubs and drink endless cocktails at other people's expense and smoke cigarettes by the dozen, for there was no tobacco tax, and a tin of players only cost a rupee. Why, here were all the luxuries and amenities of the West at the knockdown prices of the East, so that even Golders Green and Ealing lived like Mayfair and Piccadilly. Now page number 268. No wonder that all those retired empire builders in Bayswater and Knightsbridge looked up disgruntled at home and took their heads at the shortcomings of poor old England, the site for the flesh pot of the flesh pots of India. True Mrs. Mainwaring could not enjoy all those amenities of pleasurable existence, for she was being made conscious of her Celtic twilight again, having been refused admission to the Union Jack Club. The tongue of gossip too seemed busy about her, but she became conscious of a rage of vague perturbation in her soul, and trod warily in the consequence. She went out nevertheless, anxious to match at any pleasures that might come her way before Anglo-Indian society made up its mind either to shut her out completely or accept her, and really all was gay and adorable.